We are now starting to look at a number of built-in objects. And the book particularly talks about the browser object model, the document object model, and then some important global JavaScript objects. So those are all important. What I'm going to focus on here, though, is the document object model. And I think when you understand that a bit, then you'll be able to follow how it works with the browser objects and the global JavaScript objects. So remember how we've been looking at how JavaScript and HTML fit together. And the way the browser handles JavaScript and HTML. First, it parses the HTML, and it creates this internal model of the document itself, this hierarchical model that contains each HTML element. So you've got the HTML tag, the head tag, the title, script, and then inside the body, whatever you've got inside the body is represented. So each element has an object that is represented in this tree-like structure. Using JavaScript, we can access, create, remove, or modify any of the elements in the DOM. And when we do this, the updates happen dynamically and they change what's actually displayed. So that's part of the power of JavaScript, is that you can dynamically change what is on the page. Here's this example of a basic HTML document where each element is represented. You can see on the left-hand side the HTML, and then on the right-hand side what it looks like. So the question is, how do we use JavaScript to communicate with the DOM? So some of the basic activities or tasks that we can do are add things to the DOM. So for example, if you wanted to add a little bit of text on your page that is a level 1 header, you can use the document.write method to write out this piece of text. And you're just writing out HTML into the page at that point. So inside of the double quotes is just whatever HTML you want to put onto the page. You can also use document.writelen, which is a little different, which doesn't have any functional difference at this point, but you'll see both used in code. You can also access the DOM elements to do other things with them. So for example, if there is an element whose ID, remember the unique ID, is entry 1, you can get a reference to that element by using the getElementById method. Similarly, you can get a reference to all of the elements that have a particular, associated with a particular tag, like the paragraph tag here, by using getElementsByTagName. Similarly, you can get all of the elements associated with a particular class by using getElementsByClassName, document.getElementsByClassName. So each of these returns either a single object, like getElementById, or an array of objects, which the tags and the class names will return. So then you can use them to manipulate what's on the page. So what do you do with it when you have it? A lot of things. So you can set or get values for input elements. For example, if you have a text field called entry1, whose ID value is entry1, you can get the value of whatever the user typed into that field using this line of code. Document.getElementById, and then you give it the ID. So that method returns a reference to the object in the DOM, and then you can reference the value property of that object to get whatever was in there. And in this example, we've taken that and we've assigned it to the variable answer. Similarly, or the reverse, you can also do. You can set that value by putting it on the left-hand side of an assignment statement. In this case, we set the value to 37, and that would immediately change what the user sees on their screen in that form field. You can also change the inner HTML for a paragraph tag The inner HTML, I'm not sure if you've seen that property, but it's basically whatever HTML would be inside of a particular paragraph tag or other HTML element. So in this case, it's just text. But we reference the element the same way. By get element by ID, we give it the ID name, and then we reference the .inner HTML property to change what's shown on the screen. You can also change a style element for a particular tag, in this example, by referencing by using the get element by tag name method, and then you can set the style property of that element, and you can set the color property of the style property. Notice how how these things can contain nested objects, to the color red in this example. So this is kind of a complicated example of dot notation, but each of these dots is referencing the property of an object. So the document, starting from the left, the document is an object. It has a method called getElementByTagName, which returns an object. That object has a property called style, which is in itself an object that has a property called color. So let's look at an example from the book. We're going to look at the example document-object.html from chapter 3 on page 127. What that's doing is it's creating a web page, and it's creating a section on the bottom that just has some information about the document: the title, the page address, and the last modified date. So these are all things that we can get from the DOM. Let's see how. Here we have the HTML on the left, and the key thing to notice is that we have a div that's the footer div, and that's what we're going to be writing our code into. So let's look over on the right-hand side and see what it's doing. Essentially, what the big picture is, and remember, we look at the big picture first and then the details, we can see that it's creating a variable called message, and it's doing stuff, and it's adding content to that message. So it's just a string, and it adds more stuff to the string, and it concatenates more stuff to the string, and then it looks like it gets a reference to something, and then it uses that string in an assignment. So now that we've sort of done a quick scan, let's look at it in more detail. So it starts out by initializing a variable called MSG, message, and it actually is concatenating 3 strings together. So the first string is just this bit of HTML, and then it references a property of the DOM, the title property. And that is simply whatever you put into the title element in the head tag. So it just references that. And then the last piece of string that is concatenated together is this little piece of HTML, a break tag. Go down a few more lines, and we can see that we're going to add some more text to the existing message variable. So it's just going to keep adding on. The plus equals is just going to keep adding on to what's already there. And here we're adding on some more HTML. And now we're going to get a different property from the document, the URL. Same idea as before. Ditto for line 10, where we keep adding some text onto the message, the message variable. And this time we get the last modified property from the document. So these are all properties of the document that we can simply reference. Now we have this message, the string called MSG, that has a whole bunch of HTML in it. And we're going to plug that into the div tag. How do we do that? So we use the document.getElementById method, and we find the footer, the element with the ID of footer, and that returns a reference to that element, which we store in a variable called EL. And then all we do is we take and we assign the message, the value of message, which is that big long string, to the inner HTML property of that element. So essentially, whatever was in MSG is now going to get stuck in there in the document. And what we see is that at the bottom of the page, we see the page title. All that HTML that we created dynamically shows up at the bottom of the page.